have a disability by birth. It's called left hemiparesis. In my own experience of any person having a congenital disability, what tends to happen is that I think the parents are the ones who are actually going through a lot more stress than the individual. Because as a child, you don't pretty much realize that you are a person with disability. It almost seems natural to you and to your existence, and therefore, you don't realize you're any different. At least that was the case with me in my growing up years. And maybe it was because I had very strong parents who inculcated that confidence in me, and a very good set of friends also who never really made me feel different. It slowly strikes you maybe during your teenage years, because teenage years are years of transformation, and your body goes through some changes. You realize losing weight for you is slightly harder than it might have been for anybody else, and you also do not get the same kind of attention and things like that. You get it in a very different format. So for me, actually, the realization of a disability happened only in the last 3 or 4 years, when we were going through some kind of a personal phase, and I realized that maybe I am a person with disability, and I am going to be looked at differently, and managing that is important. And that is when the mental health piece comes in. Because when you start seeing yourself as one, you are going through that stage of, there's a sense of grief, there's a sense of loss, then there is a sense of acceptance, there is that entire process. I think the mind and the body is linked. And that's why mental health and physical disability, or any form of disability, is very, very clearly linked. And when I was going through this, I think I didn't even approach, I did speak to a counselor, and I didn't even approach him with the idea of talking about disability. I went in with some other problem. And then over a period of time, I think he kind of kept urging me to talk about this, he found that I was just not talking about it. Like, I would just not talk about that phase. And talking through it has helped me realize a lot more about my disability, be a lot more comfortable in it, be more comfortable as a person also overall, because the disability is one part of it, but I think each of us are much beyond that. And feel good with the disability, then feel that it need not be a part of my existence. Like you said, I am extremely privileged. Privileged because I do not have economic compulsions. I think that's fundamental. A counseling session is not very inexpensive. Neither is any of these things which you try and do. And your focus on mental health can only come in once you're done with the physical aspect of it. So that also, given I had gone through treatments in my early years, I could after a point even focus on mental health. Otherwise, for many people, they're still struggling with the physical aspect. And when you're physically going through a difficulty, mental health is not the first thing which comes in anybody's mind, right? So I think I have been privileged in that sense. Also, education, economic independence, many of those things play a part for me to be able to even talk to a counselor. And so that is one clear privilege. There are a lot of positive aspects to the whole thing. For example, I do feel that people with disability have a greater sense of resilience, because to be able to accomplish the same thing, you go through a number of times when you can't do something, and then you go ahead and you become more you're able to do it. So you go through that phase of facing that. Failure is a strong word, but facing that inability to do something and then go on to complete it. So there's greater resilience. You'll find them trying again and again. I think that is one very positive aspect. For people who have acquired disability, you suddenly, you have you have go through a phase when you're not disabled, and then you're suddenly disabled. So therefore, that acceptance of, seeing life in a different light, and the value that life has, is a lot more. It could be a lot more, because you suddenly value everything around you a lot more, because you realize the value of what you've lost as well. Creativity is at a high, because the concept of jugaad, how do you do things which you can't do otherwise? Where one has to go through a process is, like I said, one is the entire process of grief, loss, acceptance, going through that phase, etc. Especially in the case of an acquired disability, it's a lot more. In the case of a congenital one, you come around it at some point in time. So that's one. The second piece which I would think is that our society is not, especially if you have an invisible disability, or a less visible disability, you're constantly trying to prove that you're a person with disability. I may have to tell 10 people in a day that, listen, I am a person with disability, I need this accommodation or this help. And that by itself can put a lot of pressure in your mind, because you're constantly doing that. The third is, I think there is a need or a will which a person with disability has to show that they fit in. That they fit into the society, that they are not different, and that puts the pressure of trying to prove yourself all the time, which is very high mental pressure. Fourth, which I haven't personally faced, but I have seen people face, is economic. If I mix economic marginalization with disability, it's a big constraint, because in our society, if you're from a marginalized community, you're struggling as it is to get a job, you're struggling for education, you're struggling for multiple different things. And at that time, if you're also a person with disability, it only compounds the problem. And then looking at mental health is question mark. Because the person doesn't have resources to do that. And secondly, also looking at it, personally, looking at it and saying, how do I survive, becomes a huge challenge. So there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of tension which one can go through. What can people with disability do? Because I think there are a couple of different things that one can do. I think the first piece is to plan. Okay, because when you at least when you suddenly get a disability, you need to plan your life as to how will you live. If and it's true of congenital also, but just that the planning is more natural in a congenital case because the child's born with it. But how will you do different things? How will you cross the road, for example, if it's an orthopedic disability? How will you communicate if you're speech and hearing impaired, and so on and so forth? That planning to a certain extent reduces the anxiety one feels, because the anxiety is, how will I live my life? What is going to happen to me now? And that anxiety can be addressed by planning. The second is to be a part of a support group. There are support groups in Bangalore, there are support groups across the board. Any of these organizations which work in the space, just going there and spending some time will make you feel that you're not one of a kind, that you're not different, that you have people who are very similar to you and going through a similar struggle. And that is very important, if for nothing else, for the soul, because I think it makes you feel that you're not absolutely different in any ways. I would say that is the second thing. The third is, if it is really, really bothering you and you want to understand it better, that's the point I would say that one needs to see a counselor. You're struggling with it, you're not able to understand it, you're feeling like really down many times. I would say that is the point one really needs to kind of see a counselor and do something in that space. So those would be a couple of suggestions I would have. And I think overall focusing on your strengths is very important, because there is a disability, however there are a lot of strengths. So focusing and building on your strengths, which is exactly what I think I did. After a point I know that we had stopped treatments when the education had become a lot more extensive, and I had said, and my parents had said that we will focus a little more on the education piece, because let her build herself there. So focusing on your strengths kind of then reduces the impact of the disability significantly. So building on that is very important. So those would be a couple of things.